that logo, that sound, if you grew up in the 90s, then you know what I'm talking about. When you see that Capcom seal of approval, the moment you boot up your console, you knew you was in for one hell of a gaming experience. And this was an era which Capcom was just releasing IP at the IP that covered wide varieties of genres that everyone had a chance to experience and enjoy and had fond memories over, you know? And I would call this era the Golden Era of Capcom. From the 90s all the way up into the early 2000s, these were some of the best times, the best experience, especially as a gamer who enjoyed Capcom products. So I have a couple of questions, and this is why I came up with this video, because it's really been on my mind, and I wanted to have an open discussion with you guys to see if you guys are on the same page as me. And those questions are, what happened to Capcom, and what caused the sudden shift within Capcom's business model to shift in a completely different direction that pretty much make them unrecognizable today compared to what they were like from the 90s up into the early 2000s. And will Capcom ever reclaim that golden era status moving forward into the future? So I really want to talk about that. So what happened to Capcom? You know, Capcom in the past wasn't just recognized for its fighting games. They were pretty much recognized for a wide variety of IPs that they had developed in the past, and most people, for the most part, weren't just introduced to Capcom just from their fighting games such as Street Fighter. They was recognized from all varieties of genres, you know, and that's the thing that made Capcom so special, because Capcom was able to cater to gamers of all kinds of taste. You like RPGs? Well, you have Breath of Fire. You like action platformers? Well, you have Ghosts and Goblins and also Mega Man. How about puzzles? You have Puzzle Fighters. And you love being scared to death? Then you have Resident Evil and also Dino Crisis. And what about wrestling? And this is the crazy part, wrestling. Capcom even had a wrestling game, which was called Saturday Night Slam Masters, which also, in a funny way, is in the same universe and canon to Street Fighter, because Mayor Haggard from Final Fight was also a wrestler in Saturday Slam Masters. So they even had wrestling. So if you was a wrestling fan, you also had that catered towards you as well. And then what about fun co-op arcade experiences? Yes, Capcom even had a catalog of beat 'em ups, such as Final Fight, Aliens vs Predator, like Aliens vs Predator. And the funny thing is, I knew nothing about Aliens vs Predator until I was introduced to Mugen. And then Dungeons and Dragons. Capcom had a Dungeons and Dragons beat 'em up arcade fighter as well, which is definitely unique, and they had RPG elements mixed into that. So those of you guys who are into Dungeons and Dragons and also a fan of Capcom games, you were able to play that. Not only that, Captain Commando. Captain Commando was another beat 'em up that many people enjoyed. But last but not least, which I'd even never heard of until much later in my life, Cadillac and Dinosaurs. They had Cadillac and Dinosaurs. That was also a beat 'em up arcade fighter from Capcom. Cadillac and Dinosaurs. What kind of combination is that? But they had it for you guys, and it became a household name. A lot of these games that they had designed and developed with these IPs became a household name, and many people have a variety of different attachments and nostalgia based on these IPs that introduced them to the company itself. So this wasn't just from the 90s alone. There was also some great titles actually from the early 2000s, especially a lot of you guys who are subscribers to my channel were pretty much born in the era of the PS2 era. And in the PS2 era, Capcom had pretty much have given us birth to the Devil May Cry series. Yes, Devil May Cry was originally a Resident Evil title, and eventually during its development, it kind of went left field and became what we know now as DMC, Devil May Cry. And how about another title, another IP known as Onimusha, where they took the Resident Evil formula and then gave us a samurai hack and slash adventure game with horror elements to it. And now Onimusha has pretty much became an IP that was so recognizable even to this day. And then of course we have the introduction to the Monster Hunter series, and we'll definitely touch bases on this because this is definitely important to the shift in direction where Capcom has later gone into the future moving forward with their business strategy. And then of course we also have some other notable titles that we can definitely not forget. And those notable titles is Chaos Legion, God Hand, and these are two titles that I have never got a chance to experience at all because Capcom just kept releasing game after game after game after game, and it was just like a buffet of Capcom titles that I just couldn't get them all. And of course, Power Stone, I had got that on the Sega Dreamcast, and many of you guys enjoyed Power Stone. It was that party fighter game where everybody's able to get together and have fun with friends and just have one hell of a time on the Sega Dreamcast. And of course, Cannon Spike, something that I didn't see coming from Capcom, and it was highly anticipated for me as well because it took a catalog of different Capcom protagonists and characters and put them in this mega mix of a shooter where I'm not even a fan of the shoot 'em up genre, but because I had my favorite Capcom characters, I was able to just dive into the game and enjoy it. Couch co-op with my brother Keo Lancer, and I think that was pretty fun. And a lot of you guys even told me that you remember or first was introduced to Capcom through Cannon Spike. And then we cannot forget, Capcom did create a Spawn game, and it was an arcade arena fighter, which I really enjoyed. And my brother DX Strike also had the game for his Sega Dreamcast, and it was actually a pretty fun game. And to think that Capcom had a chance to actually get their hands on the Spawn IP to create a game of their own, it was one hell of a masterpiece of its time, especially for the Sega Dreamcast. And of course, we cannot forget Marvel vs. Capcom 2. This was the game that pretty much shaped everybody's experience and fond memories with Capcom themselves with Marvel vs. Capcom 2, because it just took the best of Capcom and it took the best of Marvel and crossed them over together and gave us a whole variety of different characters, team combinations, and it created one of the most biggest esports or FGC scenes of today that we know today right now, you know. So Capcom had a really good catalog up into the early 2000s, and it didn't seem like that Capcom was going to stop delivering these huge arsenal IPs, but things began to change. And what caused that change? What caused them to shift to only 3 IPs for the next couple of years moving into the future? What caused that? What brought about this sudden shift from Capcom? And I want to discuss that. And the sad thing about it is that these 3 IPs, even though they're very popular, it's just sad to see that Capcom only relies on them. I call them the 3 pillars of Capcom. And the 3 pillars of Capcom is Street Fighter, Resident Evil, and Monster Hunter. Now, these 3 giants are the pillars. And how did we end up here? How did Capcom end up just relying just on those 3 IPs and pretty much just turn their backs on the other catalogs of games that they had in the past? Why? Why did they just suddenly just let it go? They just ditched it. Well, in my opinion, the issue lies within the mid 2000s and just where we about to begin to enter the Xbox 360 and the PS3 gaming generation. This is where the gaming market had begun to make a sudden shift. But before we get into that sudden shift, Capcom was experiencing some financial issues. And those financial issues before this major shift that happened was a 5-game deal that they made with Nintendo. And the 5-game deal was PNO 03, Resident Evil 1 Remake, Killer 7, Beautiful Joe, and Resident Evil 4. And now I call these games the Big 5. And the Big 5, I can't really go into details in this video because this video will be way too long to even discuss this, because this was a major deal and this took an actual big financial hit to Capcom. But this essentially was a deal that Capcom had made, an exclusive deal with Nintendo to release these games on the Nintendo GameCube. And this had cost Capcom a crap ton of money. And out of all the franchises that I just mentioned from the Big 5, the only franchise that was really successful, Resident Evil franchise, Resident Evil Remake 1, and of course, the biggest one of them all, and which is responsible for the shift in direction with Capcom's business model, and that is Resident Evil 4. This is where Capcom, in my opinion, began to make that sudden shift, and we're going to get into that because I think that the clues are there. So, if you guys don't know, in the mid 2000s, within the gaming industry began to make a shift in a totally different direction, in a rather interesting direction, especially in the Western gaming market. The Western gaming market was experiencing an evolution, especially once once Microsoft hit the market. It opened the floodgates to many different Western developers who would normally never create games for Japanese consoles because they more so created games for the PC, something that they were more comfortable with. The technology was just something that they were used to. But Microsoft had opened that gate, the floodgate. A lot of these PC or Western developers began to develop games for the Xbox console, which also brought a variety of different games moving forward, which shaped the industry. So what games shaped the industry in the West that just totally created a shift to where the gamers in the West were starting to slowly move away from Japanese games? And that shift was the shooter genre. The shooter genre had really took the Western market by storm, which was Call of Duty, Gears of War, and even Halo. Every corner you turned, there were so many Halo clones, there were so many Gears of War clones, and Call of Duty clones that was releasing here in the West. And that was something that was really big here. And a lot of gamers from the West started shifting their attentions over to these type of games, and the Japanese market really couldn't keep up with that. And if you think about it, a lot of Japanese developers weren't really into first-person shooters. The first-person shooter is not really a big genre, especially in Japan, and Capcom wanted to pretty much get a piece of that pie, that Western market, and they needed to find a way to be able to cater to the Western market. And as a business, you have to learn how to adapt to the markets. Whatever the markets demands, you have to meet that demand. And that was something that Capcom really wanted to push forward, and that's the thing that caused them to make the shift. So what game was responsible for that shift? Resident Evil 4 was part of that shift, but there was another game that was responsible for the mindset and the business model that Capcom decided to make a different approach in order to get that Western pie. And that game was called Lost Planet. Now, if you haven't heard of Lost Planet was Capcom's first entry into creating a game for the Xbox 360 and to penetrate the Western market, because that's where developers were going over to the Xbox 360, because the PS3 architecture was kind of wonky and a lot of developers didn't really have fun developing for it at that time, at the very beginning. So Japanese developers also started shifting over to the Xbox 360. That's where we had some of even our JRPGs were crossing over to the Xbox 360. But in Capcom's case, they created a game called Lost Planet, and this was a third-person shooter. Now, this was unlike any other Capcom game that we have ever seen from them. It had less of a Japanese appeal or a Japanese approach to it, and instead it had more of an American third-person shooter approach to it, even though they added the mechas, which is more of a Japanese thing, but they also crossed it over into the shooter genre that you will see in games like Gears of War. So it had that more of that shooter-esque experience that Western developers or Western gamers really enjoyed the most. And then of course they had their multiplayer aspect to it, and of course they had their Japanese protagonists to still let people know, hey, this is still a Japanese developed game. But this game had definitely changed their mindsets, especially moving over to Lost Planet 2. Lost Planet 2 started going more and more into the Western type of feel rather than being more of a Japanese feel of type of game. It crossed between a shooter and a Monster Hunter type experience, but it felt more of a third-person shooter that most Western developers or Western gamers tend to like of that time. And then after that, once that happened, we started to see games like Dead Rising. Dead Rising was more of a Western appeal rather than a Japanese appeal. So you started seeing these different shifts. Capcom started to feel less Japanese and started focusing more on that Western demographic. And even though Dead Rising was a pretty good IP for those who really enjoyed that franchise, it still started slowly fading away from that Japanese appeal. And then they decided to try to revive Bionic Commando. And the thing is about Bionic Commando, which failed miserably, was because they tried to take a different twist, a different approach. It also had more of an American or a Western appeal to it, and they just couldn't hit the mark, and it didn't sell really well at all. And the storyline was kind of convoluted. It didn't make sense at times, and it failed. And Bionic Commando was another IP that they had released in the past, and it didn't work out because of this new approach that they went with, and it kind of just faded away from existence. Now you never hear anything from Bionic Commando, except they decided to make a re-release or a remastered classic for the Xbox Live Arcade. Now, IPs like Mega Man, Breath of Fire, Ghouls and Ghosts, a lot of those franchises of that time has now haven't made the shift over to this new business model. They couldn't adapt those franchises, and then they begin to get left in the dust. We stopped seeing Project Justice or games like Plasma Sword or any of those type of like Power Stone and those type of games. We didn't see them anymore. They just totally ditched it. And games like Devil May Cry, they started shifting it more to the Western appeal to it, but still had that Capcom taste to it and flair to it. Devil May Cry was able to somewhat survive the test of time before they went on a disappearance as an IP for a while. Now, when it came to Resident Evil had a winning formula already, which was Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 worked. It was a formula that definitely improved the genre, which a lot of games after that decided to clone and replicate themselves that we still see in today's era. And Resident Evil 4 began to move over to Resident Evil 5, and it started ditching away with what made Resident Evil, and it became more of a action-based shooter because of the success of the shooter genre here in the West. And then, of course, Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter had finally found its success over on the PSP. They found a market that really catered to an audience that's able to have this experience anywhere on the go. So that began to make them a lot of money, and it created a big influence up to this very day. So Monster Hunter proved that, hey, it works. Make it portable. It made them money, so that became their pillar. Resident Evil 4 formula worked, so they carried it on to the other Resident Evil games. Despite the controversy of this new direction, it became a pillar to them. And of course, we cannot forget the return of Street Fighter, because Street Fighter has been dormant for some time, especially after the Capcom Fighter Jam, and then the lack of success from Street Fighter Third Strike at the time. And even though Third Strike is a pretty popular game today, it was never a popular game in the past. So they had to pretty much take a break from fighting games. So fighting games was dormant until Ono came back with Street Fighter 4. Ever since Street Fighter 4 came, the rise of fighting games, the fighting game genre has came back, and then Street Fighter once again has became a pillar to the Capcom name. So now that we have that, and now that we pretty much laid everything on the table, the shift in the Western market has pretty much convinced Capcom to pretty much change their whole business model, because they wanted a piece of that American or Western pie. And that's what made them abandon a lot of their franchises, because a lot of their older IP just couldn't adapt, or they couldn't figure out a way to adapt that to that new model that they had. So they pretty much just ditched it and abandoned it. So the question is now, will Capcom ever reclaim what they used to be? Would they ever reclaim that golden era status? And in my opinion, I don't think it ever will. I mean, Capcom's a totally different beast. They're not the same company as they used to be. Now we live in a totally different landscape. Gaming is much different than what it used to be back in the 90s to early 2000s. Now if you look at Capcom, everything is digital now. We talking about, there's microtransactions. Capcom got microtransactions in their games, and it's sad to see games like Devil May Cry, a single player experience, has microtransactions in it. Then we have Street Fighter 5. Street Fighter 5 was a game that focused more on advertisements that you'll see plastered all over the place while the loading screen comes on, and you could purchase cosmetics. And of course, we can't forget the failure with Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, where they tried to roll out a totally different business model and a esports initiative. And that's the thing about esports. Capcom is more focused with the Capcom Cup now and their esports, and try to promote a much broader appeal or live service product. It seems that's where Capcom and many companies are now going, is to the live service. So they aren't the same company anymore. And despite Capcom have success with these three pillars, which is Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, and of course Street Fighter, of course they also had their issues as well. And if you look at Capcom with Street Fighter 5 started off on a very bumpy start experience. Pretty much the gamers were the alpha beta testers, and eventually after 7 years, Capcom with Street Fighter V has pretty much became an experience that it should have been earlier on in its life cycle. And of course, Resident Evil had to reinvent itself. And even though Resident Evil, in the shifting direction that it changed itself to with the Resident Evil 4 formula, it was quite successful, but it upsets the traditional fans who were more excited about the survival horror aspect to Resident Evil rather than the shoot 'em up third-person shooter action experience. So they had to shift their direction once again, which now they went into a first person, which is something that they're very reactionary. It's still reacting to the first person genre, which is highly praised and very lucrative here in the Western market. So Resident Evil 7 and also Resident Evil 8 had decided to take a different approach by making it a first-person experience, survival horror experience. And even despite it selling well, the game still has its controversy and split within the Resident Evil community. And of course, you can't forget Monster Hunter, the third and final pillar, which is also successful. And it did have its controversy at one point, is when they decided to ditch the portable for a bit and decided to release Monster Hunter World on the PlayStation 4, release it on the consoles. Now, this was also a big debate. This was also something that they was really taking a risk, especially after Monster Hunter has been from the PSP and then onto the Nintendo 3DS for some time, and it became very lucrative with Nintendo. They had such an amazing experience. And at the same time, once this announcement had happened with Monster Hunter World, Nintendo had no idea what was going on with Monster Hunter World, that it was going over to Sony. But Capcom did rest assured and let them know that there will be a Nintendo exclusive Monster Hunter that will be coming, which is Monster Hunter Rise, which is actually doing really good, and they have a big expansion which I really want to talk about and really get into moving forward as well. We'll talk about that in another video. But in my opinion, Capcom isn't the same company that it used to be, and I don't think it would ever go back into that golden era. And the only thing we can do now is move forward and just hope for the best. Hope that hopefully they will come back and just think about certain things and bring back certain franchises. Even though some of those IPs that we know and love, they may not come back the same way. They may come back much differently now that we in a different gaming landscape and everything. And just hopefully they just don't ruin that experience. I would love to see a Power Stone return, Rival Schools return, or aka Project Justice, or Plasma Sword, or we did see a new Ghouls and Ghosts. We did see that, and that did pretty well for itself. But I would love to see other franchises make a return. How about Dino Crisis? We had Exo Primal, which was released, which was revealed, and that Capcom seemed so out of touch with his fan base, and it really upset a lot of their fans that they weren't getting a Dino Crisis game, but instead another live service, always online co-op experience. And this is the things that I'm talking about, which doesn't make me confident in whether or not Capcom will ever reclaim that golden era status. But that's pretty much my opinion. You know, Capcom had created some fond memories that I had growing up as a child, and many of you guys growing up in the 90s to early 2000s, they had created some of the most respectable IPs of its time. And it's sad to see that Capcom had just turned their back and just left those franchises in the dark abyss, and we may not ever see them ever again, and that's a shame. And it seemed like that the Western market had definitely played such a big impact and influence in how they conduct business and change their business model moving forward, to the point that they're only relying on 3 pillars, which is Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, and Street Fighter. So definitely want to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think about Capcom, and do you think they will ever reclaim that golden status era ever again? And tell me some of your memories and how you were introduced to Capcom in the comment sections below. So if you like the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and if you want to stay up to date with more gaming news or anything just Capcom related as well, just hit that bell to be notified. This is MugenLord signing off. I'll see you game fiends later. Peace out.